Michael from Fat Troll Gaming and my friend Chris here. And this is our podcast, Stitches Instead of Band-Aids, where we talk about problems that we face in our country and around the world and actual fixes for them instead of the band-aids that our politicians usually offer us. And last time we were here last week, we started talking about the wonderful justice system and how wonderful that is and what sort of things that, well, we talked a lot about what the problems are with justice and kind of what justice is so that we could get a better idea. And today we're going to talk about what ideal justice looks like and maybe get to some solutions, but no promises because this is a very complicated subject.
Yep. So you want to start us off?
Sure, I think we're going to actually have some disagreements on this one. Actually, I think we're going to have a lot of disagreements on this one on what ideal justice is. Because I think we have very different viewpoints on what ideal justice looks like or an ideal policing looks like. Because for me, um, ideal policing, while different than its current state, doesn't have a lot of the major reforms I think you're interested in seeing happen.
Okay.
Um, so, with that, I'll kind of lay out what I think is ideal. I, if we're talking about fantasy ideal, obviously there would be zero deaths, and the police would always be able to bring in every suspect without killing them, always.
Mm-hmm.
But I realize that is an impossibility. So,
I would agree that it is an impossibility.
so even though that is an ideal, it's not real. So, what I would offer is that we try to get that as low as possible. And when we do have, say, a police shooting, because they will happen, that the police are not the ones um, in charge of handling that investigation. Um, I think that there needs to be a tier system for policing, basically. So, whereas we kind of have that where there's like meter maids. Meter maids don't have firearms, but they have the ability to do some policing things, such as issue tickets and things like that. I think we need to expand that and have a tier of officer that is not armed, that is more specialized training in things regarding like mental health, that sort of thing, and responds can be an initial responder to those sorts of calls and
Mm-hmm.
assess whether they need to bring in a second tier officer who
Mm-hmm.
is more trained on things like de-escalation. Um, well, not more trained than obviously the kind of the lowest tier, but they're trained on how to de-escalate situations where force is required and or could be required.
Mm-hmm.
And they would be above them, and then there would be a third tier whose only job is to police. Um, and not like internal affairs where you get promoted from a police department. These people are totally trained differently. Um, they don't have any interactions with police departments beyond their investigations of the police, so that they
Mhm.
don't make any inroads, and how they got there wasn't based off of being good at the system that they're meant to police in, because I think the fraternity aspect of policing is important. Like there's part of that that's important. And that would automatically, you can't have the people who are policing the police be part of that, like, fraternal order, if that makes sense. They have to be separate. And sure, that would be rough for I mean, that a lot of people might think that's rough to have someone that's never done the job judge, but they would be heavily trained, um, specifically to perform that duty. Um, and maybe, like, how that system starts, um, that's getting into the solution. But my ideal idea of policing would be a 3-tier system with some sort of lower level that handles situations that are not likely to escalate into confrontation, then a second tier that is designed to handle confrontation, and then a third tier that is to handle specific acts of policing that could be characterized as, well, overuse of force. So they would handle any sort of investigations or complaints into the police department. And then they would also handle any case immediately. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's justified or not, even if it's like super clear cut. If there is a police caused death, that agency would immediately take up the case and look into it and go over every single detail and make recommendations whether it was justified, or if it was not justified and charges should be brought.
Mhm.
So, and that's kind of like my ideal way policing
Okay.
would be done.
Okay.
Go ahead and tell everyone what
I
your ideal system would be.
um so my ideal system would in a way be similar and in a way be different because couple of differences specifically involve the idea of being able to differentiate calls at like the dispatch level, um, because it is not an easy prospect to differentiate calls to send specific different types of officers to a specific type of call. Um, I can give examples of a number of things that seem like easy calls and then ended up in crazy situations, sometimes involving officer deaths. Um,
Oh, I realize this. Like, that's why there. So in my tier system, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
when a call comes into dispatch, right? Like if it's obvious, okay, we need tier 2 or use of force type police, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would immediately be sent. If it's a type tier 1 call, right?
Mm-hmm.
The officer there can
Right.
request a tier 2 officer and they come in. And the idea is that use of force calls should be relatively low, right? Like most calls should be handled by tier 1 officers, right? Now where there is no
Right.
force that's kind of going to be necessary. So tier 2 officers should have a much easier time, right? Cuz they're not dealing with all the tier 1 stuff like police are currently, right? Police are currently swamped um handling all type police dispatches, right? And so it's not easy for police to call for backup on for themselves because they could all be tied up, right? So this would
Right.
allow for the second tier should be enough that for the most part a lot of them are just sitting around waiting to be called on, right? There's here or here or here, right? And they're
Mm-hmm.
spread out enough throughout their district that ideally they should be able to get to anyone within a few minutes. Ideally, right? Because we're talking about an
Mm-hmm.
ideal here, not
Yeah.
perfection. Because perfection is you don't even ever need tier 2 police because nothing will ever happen, right? But it's not the case. But ideally, right,
Mm-hmm.
should be between 3 and 5 minutes, right? And the threshold for a tier 1 officer to call in backup from a tier 2 officer, like the tier 1 officer should be able to do that relatively easily, right? Their judgment should be trusted on this can go south on me very quickly. I'm not armed with deadly force. It's a possibility where deadly force it could escalate into that sort of situation. I need someone here that can do that, right?
Right.
So on those weird calls where they can't easily be classified, dispatch
Yeah.
sends out somebody and then okay, this can go south. Like this is gonna like if the tier 1 officer comes up and punches are being swung or something, right? Like there's already violence going on or someone has a weapon,
Mm-hmm.
they can just immediately call tier 2. Like they don't even have to interact. Like this is what ideally like their training would be like, right? Like they would be able to very quickly assess. And if it's a situation like there's a weapon already out,
Mm-hmm.
that they should not even have to engage, right? Like they
Yeah.
just park from a distance away and say, "Look, we're bringing in the tier 2 people. Just put your gun down or whatever, right?" And shouting
Well, they
from
should
a distance and
they knew there was a that kind of thing going on.
yeah, right? Like but I'm talking like they get a call like, "Oh, he's like Superman. He's going to, or something like that, like where it's like
Right.
he's not in his right mind. He took something, right? And he's acting really strange, right? And then they show up, and the guy who's acting really strange or something has a freaking gun that person
Mm-hmm.
on 911 call did not tell dispatch. Like, you would think
Yep.
that's relevant, but, whatever. They're in a stressful situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, no, that tier 1 officer is like, okay, well, this is way out of my class.
Mm-hmm.
Parks a house down the road, tries to get the guy's attention so he's focused on him instead of the person who called or whatever, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that he's the one taking off. So he's acting as a protection. He's pulling the attention away. And he immediately calls for someone that can use force, right? And says, hey, just he stays back, he stays behind his police car, has them coming, and is like, hey, let's try to talk this out. Maybe tries to talk the guy down if he's not shooting at him, right? Otherwise, he just hides behind the car and, he has like a taser or something, whatever, right? And it's like, oh, okay, I'm going to tase you or whatever if you get any closer. And maybe he has some of those long distance taser rounds, right? And he try to shoot one off or something like that. But for the most part, he's just sitting there holding the guy's attention until tier 2 officer can arrive, right? That's how that situation would go.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it would suck to be a tier 1 officer, in my personal opinion, right? Like, it would be a very dangerous job, and they should be paid very well because they would need to be educated. One, like, they're not just responding to things, they would need at least an associate's degree, if not a bachelor's degree, in something like psychology or something like that, where they can deal with these sort of problems, psychology or social work or something to that nature, right? And then on top of that, they would need training on, policing practices and things like that. So they would need to get paid well for having to go through a 4-year degree and things like that. Now, the police officers who use force, I don't know if they would necessarily need a 4-year degree in social work or psychology, right? Because they're not designed. Their role is not to try and talk people down or deal with people with mental illnesses. They're called in once things have hit the point where shit's hit the fan, right? And
Right.
force is likely going to be used. Now, I still want them to have like a 2 or 4-year education. And most of that education should be focused on knowing the amount of force to use, right? Like lots of training in self defense and marksmanship and in use of force theory and things like that. Like they should know, okay, here's the amount of force that I am going to need to use to make sure that this is going down, like that this situation is going to resolve. But they should be trained highly enough and specialized enough that they are getting as close as possible to the absolute minimum amount of force that could be used, right? Like their job is to get that amount of, not to overuse force, but to use it down to the minimum necessary. And that requires a lot of training. Like that takes a lot of experience to be able to determine the exact amount of force used to successfully resolve the situation safely, right? Because I mean that's like um I know this story of a guy in Texas, right? He used a sword to deal with 3 home intruders that had guns, right? It was all in close range because when you're close enough on somebody, a knife is actually going to be more effective than a gun. But the thing that was really cool about this, right, is instead of like you would think, well, okay, someone's here trying to kill me, right? I'm allowed in self-defense to use deadly force against them, and with a sword you could easily take out 3 people and kill them even though they have guns on you, right? But what was really cool is he didn't kill them. He successfully injured them without inflicting any deadly wounds. And he was able to then disarm them, take their guns away, and wait for police to arrive. But he's somebody that had been practicing swordplay for like decades, right? any normal person who had just basic training. This is the difference between like a master swordsman and just a trained swordsman is a trained swordsman would just go for the kill, right? Because that is the least amount of force that they can use that they know will end the situation. Whereas a master can use non-lethal force, even though lethal force is open to him, and still know that he can end the conflict successfully. And the idea is that our second tier police should be at that level where they know the exact amount of force that can be used to successfully resolve the situation, which is a lot more training and stuff than our current police have. So,
Yep.
anyway, go ahead.
Oh no, um that all sounds perfectly reasonable to me in terms of a set of uh, reforms. The only other uh, thing that I would involve would be a focus on local recruitment of officers and putting, especially tier one officers, um, in communities that they are familiar with, in order to generate familiarity with the community, because it helps to be able to do the job of interacting with people in a community who are in crisis if you are familiar with people in the community.
Yeah,
And part of the issue for some of the larger police departments right now is that you have people from the far side of a city of 1 million people or more than 1 million people effectively treating it like it's their day job, and they don't really know a lot of the people in the area they are patrolling. That is something you can build up over time while you're on patrol, but it takes time to generate and maintain that kind of community goodwill that makes the job of policing easier.
yeah, and it's that's something I just don't think can happen um, with big cities. Like you got to realize, like in a
Yeah.
city, right? Like you could have an apartment building in one of these cities that has more people than some towns have.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it's just like a small town usually has a good reputation with its police force unless the sheriff is corrupt as hell and everyone knows it. And usually those sheriffs are elected, so they don't stay sheriff for very long. But
Mm.
the reason everyone knows each other is because there's like 500 people in town. And it's like, or 1,000, right?
Right.
Like it's in a manageable amount because like our brains are like designed to handle somewhere between like
Mm-hmm.
100 to 500 connections. Like
Mm-hmm.
we are not designed to be
Mm-hmm.
able to handle um, 10,000 connections. So if you were to get a police officer to handle a community, right? Like say um say like one of those apartment buildings, right? you would need one police officer for like every couple of floors.
Right. Right. Mm,
Like
you
that
feel
that's the issue, right?
yeah, that is definitely an issue. I think that to a degree that can be helped just with community outreach. And I you actually talked about elected sheriffs. I would like more kind of electoral oversight of police departments outside of the kind of sheriff setting where sheriffs are elected. Because a lot of police departments in big cities are quite entrenched. Even if the city council or the commissioners or the mayor or however it's administrated would like to institute change, ultimately change, even just in terms of changing who the police chief is, can be really hard to do. So even if we know that if the people in charge who have to deal with the police chief on a regular basis know that the police chief doesn't particularly care about enforcing training requirements, it can be really hard to move the police chief out of office and get the deputy police chief into office.
Yeah. No, it can definitely be a problem. That's for sure.
Right.
But usually, like sheriffs are elected. It depends on the jurisdiction, to be honest. But usually, it's like once every 2 or 3 years. So even when there is a corrupt sheriff, he doesn't stay. He usually doesn't stay in very long. So
Right.
there
And
is that.
right now in police departments, there is a trend towards uh, police chiefs being very trumpeted as like, oh, 31-year veteran of the force. And it's like, okay, does that actually make them a good administrator? Does that make them a good person for understanding training, for dealing with the breadth of uh, the issues from a police chief standpoint rather than a policing standpoint kind of deal?
Yeah, no,
It's a
I'm
similar issue that we see, that personally I believe we see in a fair number of other industries where that promote on seniority because, oh, you get more money for being a manager, and they want to promote you to a manager position if you're reliable and you show up for work and you don't have so many infractions on your record. But does that mean you're actually a good manager? Not necessarily. It could just mean you're the least problematic employee for your bosses.
yeah, that's true. But honestly, for with what you're saying about the just he's been a veteran for so many years on the force,
Mm-hmm.
like to an extent that happens. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
But because I've lived in these small towns with sheriffs that are elected, right?
Right.
Like,
Oh, this is really a big city thing where, like, the mayor is introducing the new police chief and is like,
yeah, no,
"What's
the
force," kind of thing.
yeah, no, and the elected ones were like I've been part of, right? Like they have to have a platform that they're running on, like how the police department's going to be run.
Right.
Like usually they have to convince the electorate that this is how a police force should be run. This is how we're going to police you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they'll go debates. Like sheriffs have debates.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be like and there'll be questions like, do you think ticket quotas are a good idea for a police department, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh well, or it's like, should there be a ticket written for someone going 6 or 7 miles over the speed limit? Like, what is your process of giving out like people get involved in those sort of
Mm-hmm.
debates, like the people who care and like actually go, and they will like really drill hard questions into sheriffs about policing and like
Right.
what are you going to do about noise complaints at like 1 o'clock in the morning, like how are you going to
Mm-hmm.
respond and things like that. And really police, like sheriffs, they get
Yep.
drilled. Like they'll get
Oh,
asked like 500 different questions about different policing tactics and things like that. Like
no, I
what
would personally say as they should be because often policing is and failures of policing are some of the most motivating parts of just existing as a citizen because when they're not enforcing the speed limit on my residential street that my kids play next to the street, well, that becomes an immediate issue.
yeah.
And in some places, it takes a lot of effort to find someone to actually talk to about, hey, can you enforce the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit? Because I'm pretty sure there are people going through here at 40, 45.
Oh yeah. And no, it's definitely a thing. And
Yeah. And the responsiveness of sheriff's departments to those kinds of issues is a good thing.
yeah, but like I was saying, it's like maybe that's an issue. Once again, a lot of these problems are issues for big cities. Like,
Yep.
what is the city going to do? Well, the city is going to do this. Okay, well, or, this guy's so great, and I'm just going to appoint him, which is really just a way of saying he's he's managed to gain enough connections
Mm-hmm.
that he's going to be promoted, right? Like he's kicked enough butt, he's kissed enough politicians' butts
Mm-hmm.
to earn his promotion,
Yep.
for
Yeah.
lack of a better way of saying it, right? Like he's just, all a police chief is usually just he's a politician. And it's one of the reasons why I didn't find the testimony of the police chief in the Chauvin trial to be particularly interesting or persuasive, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he didn't really talk. He talked about the ethics and values of the police department, and he sounded like a politician on the stand. It's like, yes, we know that the police department has a public image to uphold, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you're trying to uphold it, and you're trying to do it on the stand and make Chauvin look like a complete douchebag that had no respect for human dignity because you're politically motivated to do that. Because I know what your position entails. Your position does not entail training. It does not entail the day-to-day operations of your police force. It is about presenting a public face to the police department, which is important, right? Like, I'm not saying that's not important, right? But it's like you were the wrong person to be called up onto the stand.
Right. And
Um, at least
ultimately,
for me, like, which
yeah.
some
And
people probably got persuaded by him. So,
well, as a political thing, often they're pushing this idea of, oh, it's not a systemic problem because we're all good people. It's just, oh, there are a few bad apples, and uh, in that case, oh, Chauvin was a bad apple. And it's like, was he though, or could this have happened with any of multiple officers from the police department who would have been in the same situation?
yeah.
Because that would indicate systemic failure rather than, oh, pin all the blame on one guy to try to win back your public support.
And in
And
all
broadly,
honesty,
I think it hasn't been successful in trying to win public support.
well, yeah, I mean that's it's like I don't know. I think it was horrible. And we found out. I don't know if you heard this,
Mm-hmm.
and this is kind of sidetracking, but I don't know if you heard this, but there was a case that the prosecution was trying to bring in to the Chauvin trial that I
Mm-hmm.
think would have, like, the prosecution was trying to bring this up, but I think it would have, I don't know if it would have hurt or helped, but for me, it would have hurt their case, like, in my personal opinion. And it's, Chauvin had done something similar in the past to somebody, right? And he had kneeled on someone's neck, the neck area, right? The same sort of restraint and everything, after choking out the kid, because it was I think it was like a 14-year-old kid, right? But the kid was like 6'2" and like 200 and something pounds. So it wasn't like he was a small, like, teenager, right? No, he was a big dude. But Chauvin choked the kid out, right? Like, with his hands, till he went unconscious. And then after he went unconscious, he handcuffed the kid behind his back and then kneeled on him with his knee on the guy's neck area, on the kid's neck area, and held him down for 14 minutes until paramedics arrived. Like, Chauvin had done that before and did it for a much longer period of time than he did with George Floyd, and there was no death. Like, if that was told to me, I'd be like, so you're saying that Chauvin didn't kill Floyd? Like, what he had done in the past and based on his prior experiences, that this was not dangerous and would not have caused death?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I don't get why the prosecution would try to edge that.
yeah, no, the prosecution fought for it too. And I was like, because this case came to light afterwards, right? Like, after the whole court case, right? And that was part of what the prosecution wanted to bring. I was like, why would the prosecution want to bring that up? Like, that is reasonable doubt right there. Like, if you have to give me that Chauvin was the cause of death, and if you're giving me an example where he did something exactly the same, and I think actually in worse circumstances, right? Because the kid was already unconscious when he handcuffed him and then put his knee on the guy's neck, right? Like, according to, like, all of your expert witnesses, that means the kid should have died, right? Like, I mean, and that just, I was like, that is just so surprising that the prosecution wanted that. But besides the point, like, Chauvin obviously used way too much force a lot of the time and probably should have been off of the force already. And the fact that he was never really reprimanded for doing these sort of things show that it's more of a systemic problem with the Minneapolis Police Department than it is with Chauvin himself.
Mhm.
Because they gave him the okay on, yeah, you can keep doing stuff like that.
Yep.
Like, I mean, what else do you call it when he doesn't get fired for doing something that great, like that aggressive?
Mm. Yep.
I mean, honestly.
So, I mean, going back to the whole main thrust, I mean, there is not much more I'd say I would want. I'm just trying to think because that covers most things. I mean, different different training regimen, uh, more electoral control.
Oh, well, I didn't
Uh,
have anything on electoral control.
yeah. Well, I mean, I've already brought it up, so it's like because it's like it's I
I do
I
not know how you fix city police departments. Like, there's just too many people to get that sort of like community based policing.
yes, it is definitely a problem, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure on some level it's ever totally going to be uh, fixable, but I think that some of it at least is going to be fixable if the people who are in the community believe that their police and police department is actually there to uh, enforce the laws that are created as community standards, kind of thing that we talked about last episode, um, in terms of the way justice works. If
Yeah,
people believe that the cops are actually there for justice, then I think a lot of the issues tend to resolve themselves. Um, like in my job right now, I have um, I have had a significant number of interactions with the police thanks to the public who I deal with uh, in my job. Yay. Not going into details, but the public is, uh, well, they're not great.
they're not.
Often, like when 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 you're dealing with a random selection of people, like my job basically entails, is oh hey, these are just whoever shows up, and sometimes we we deal with a lot of people, and sometimes it's just you get some strange people, you get some weird happenings, and it's like, okay, security isn't going to take care of this. We need to trespass someone and be like, no, you have to get off the property and you have to stay off, go away. Don't want your problems here.
Ah,
And
you don't
I try
want their
to,
problems?
uh, um, some of the people we have, I'm not sure who would want their problems, but um, it's just The cops in my area have always done pretty well by me and uh, our business in terms of showing up and doing things reliably and treating everybody fairly and explaining to people like, no, you have been told you need to leave. You need to leave because there are some people who do not get that. Do not ask me how there are people who do not get somebody telling you, you are not welcome here, please leave, does not somehow end up with them actually leaving. They just stay. I know. I wouldn't try to do that, but some people do. And those are the people we have to call the cops on for that because most people are fine leaving if we tell them, yo, settle down or you have to leave. They'll settle down or they'll leave.
Yep.
It's just
Well,
and
that's the nature of the police, right?
right, from our point of view, they've always done well for us in terms of enforcing that kind of idea of justice. Now, I know that there are other people and other places in the city where there are definite questions as to whether the police are doing their job. Luckily, and I'm going to say this, luckily, I do not live in those areas of that city. I live little ways further out. It's a bit longer of a drive to my work, and it's not like I could walk, but I like where I live, and I haven't had any issues in terms of our policing here. I mean, outside of the fact that people do go a little fast on the road out front, but I also tend to go a little fast on the road out front, so I don't
How could you?
call the police on people for that. It's like
How could you go a little fast out front?
I forget the road is a 30-mile-an-hour road because the state speed limit around here is 55, and it looks like all the roads that are at the state speed limit of 55. But no, technically it's inside the city limits of a different city, so the city speed limit applies.
Ah,
But anyway,
it's
the police have always
just there
been
to
good.
confuse you, huh?
The police have always been good for us in terms of enforcing the kind of rule of law, social contract, justice as it is. And I think some of the bigger issues of policing tend to be how police deal not necessarily with one-off issues like we have at my work, tend to be more how the police deal with uh, more entrenched criminal structures. So things like longer running fraud schemes, things like criminal activity on the gang level, whether it's racketeering or protection money or whether it's black market stuff, whether it's theft and fencing stolen goods, or the drug trade, or unregulated weapons trade, or any of those kinds of black market things. And those, I think, do entail a need for a dedicated investigatory kind of aspect of not necessarily police, but law enforcement, because there does need to be somebody who goes, wait, what's going on with all of these things, and are there any links together? And you don't wait until somebody gets killed because you have two rival organizations that are both fighting over the same piece of territory in terms of the ability to sell or do petty crime in that kind of territory.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time here in America, investigations are secondary to a crime having already occurred. So, as much as like taking down the mafia in New York City a while ago was a big thing that needed to happen, it took years, and it ultimately was not successful on a number of possible charges that they could have had. It was related to the successful investigation and prosecution was about the death of one mob boss that was part of this group of mafia families. The death of one of them that they argued was ordered by the others.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, that meant that if that hadn't happened, the entire investigation wouldn't have happened, or wouldn't have actually come to fruit and led to prosecution and convictions of people who were not good people. Like, these are the type of people who were throwing any workers or union people who tried to go, oh, maybe we shouldn't maybe we should use somebody who's not one of these mob-based building supply people companies as a building supply contractor for our building because they artificially jack up prices. Yeah, if you suggested that, you got thrown out of a 50th story window.
I wonder why that is. Just for a suggestion.
And they would say you must have tricked or something, and they would make sure you weren't wearing a hard hat so that they could be like, oh, he must not have been following the safety protocols and all of that. But it's like, for that kind of stuff, it's literally just money. Because, and in New York City at the time, there were so many people building stuff, building buildings, tearing down shorter buildings, building taller buildings in New York City, that the fact that the mob had a chokehold on uh, concrete, on steel, and on wood supply coming into the city for any major contracts meant that they were making a lot of money.
Yep. And that's an issue, right? Like,
Right.
that's when you need to get a forensic accountant and stuff.
Well, that's why, in terms of law enforcement, I think we can't just look at
Isn't that how they
look at.
got Al Capone?
Yes, that is how they got Al Capone. Actually, was for proving that Al Capone was making significant amounts of income by tracking the books of his organization. They never proved how he was making the income, just that he was making significant amounts of income
And not paying
that meant he
taxes.
was evading income taxes. Yeah.
Good old IRS.
Well, that kind of thing is often right now federal investigations and this kind of patchwork of other investigations when the idea that, oh, the police can't stop the killings from a group like the mafia reflects negatively on police and law enforcement as a whole. And to that extent, in my opinion, there definitely needs to be some kind of organization, whether it's part of the police department or whether it's some other investigatory aspect that does not just react to, oh, hey, a crime has occurred, let's investigate that, but go, well, how do things actually work out here on the ground, and can we identify illegal behavior or motives for illegal behavior that would mesh things together? It's often hard to get members of criminal organizations to talk about their affiliation with the organization because those organizations can find you nearly wherever you are. But
And they're very proactive of silencing loose lips.
yes, they are very proactive, and that's part of what definitely makes them a problem. Is just they are active at doing what they do, and right now law enforcement is almost entirely reactive, not proactive. So somebody gets murdered in the city, and then there's an investigation into why the person was murdered, and maybe charges are brought. But that doesn't help when people are saying, oh, why can't you stop the murders from happening?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that comes down to individual communities though, right? Like
Right.
you might get some pot farmer out in the middle of redneck woods, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they're growing pot and they're just like the local pot dealer, right? But
Right.
if the local pot dealer ever got to the point where local pot dealer was shooting up cops or shooting up kids, right? The
Mm-hmm.
local pot dealer would would have an issue not from the police. Like somebody's,
Right.
you know, somebody's parent would show up to said pot dealer's house with a freaking shotgun
Mhm.
or an AR-15, and there would not be
Mhm.
a pot dealer anymore. And the police would
Mhm.
be like, "Come on, dude. Like, we know it's the pot dealer, but you can't just go and kill the pot dealer because he shot your son," type deal, right? Like, well, but the community wouldn't stand for it, right? Like they might stand for a pot dealer who's growing his own pot and selling it, right? They might not like it, but there's no real harm being done, right? But as
Mhm.
soon as like someone goes and hurts somebody, right, or someone gets killed, you know,
Mhm.
the community goes and takes care of it.
Yeah.
Like the police are there to handle small potato things, right, in a lot of these rural communities.
Yeah.
And anything that happens that's big is usually taken care of by locals. So you don't get any gangs or mafias or anything like that because, well, if there was one, it would it would be stomped out. Not by the police, mind you, right? Like it would be the community that wouldn't stand for it. And the idea is that, you have a lot of these organizations just I feel like it was like, oh, it started off as something like, well, kids will be kids type things with gangs, and then it turned into a permanent problem.
Mhm.
Um, and if your attitude about that sort of thing is kids will be kids, or, a parent is willing to cover for a child's crime type deal and cover it up,
Mhm.
like, that's a problem. And the police can't deal with that, right? Like,
Right.
there's no way the police are reactionary because they can't go arresting people for no crimes having been committed, right? Like we
I mean,
wouldn't accept the police arresting someone saying, well, he's part of this organization, so
I think that's perhaps the primary difference there a between the idea of the city and the countryside, because it's oftentimes in the city you don't try to enforce any ideas of justice yourself, you call the cops. And sometimes it's the cops aren't interested in, oh, your kid is skipping school or something like that. Your kid is doing minor illegal that may ultimately lead into something bigger, or like selling stolen goods on the street or something. Like a parent goes and says, "I think maybe my kid is selling stuff on the street in his off hours," and it's like, "Wait, what?" And the police may not care. And in a rural community, um, there is the idea of, well, we take care
beat
of that
yeah beat
ourselves.
yeah beat your child and tell them that never do it again, or you'll personally drive them down to the sheriff's office and let them rot in jail for the rest of their lives. The police are used as a threat, but it's not like I'm going to call the police on you. No, I'm going to drive you down to the local sheriff
Right.
and tell the sheriff to leave you locked in a jail cell.
Or if there's if there's like, I don't know, some group of local youths who hang out somewhere and threaten people coming out of convenience stores to take their smokes, like some like real low level stuff. But that's how all of this starts usually, is you start out with the low level stuff and then it gets worse. A lot of the times members of the community, if the parents won't address it, members of the community won't take it upon themselves to address it and go, hey, knock it off. It's not cool. You shouldn't be doing that. And sometimes it just doesn't stick for kids when it's not coming from someone who actually has power over them, like their parents or the police. Because, I mean, what are you? If somebody comes up and says, "Hey, stop what you're doing," it's like, are you going to stop me? Yes? No?
Yeah,
No?
in a rural community, they would just smack them upside the head if they said something stupid like that. Like that would get you smacked by any
Right.
adult.
And I think it's really a difference in mindset of, well, these, and perhaps it's just a city thing, because it's like, oh, you don't know the parents of the kids who are hanging out in front of your apartment building, so you don't know who to go to and go, oi, you children, the fucking up, and go fix your kids.
Yeah.
And part of it is that there are already criminal organizations around, so sometimes if you do try to say something like that to a group of youths, they can just be like, oh, you want to go, old man, and pull a gun on you. And heck, I'd be the old man at this point. I'm nearly 30. They'd probably call me an old man, make me feel old.
Yep, they call you an old man.
Say, thanks, criminal youth, for calling me old.
Yep, they call you old man and then laugh at you and pull a gun.
Pull a gun and just go, yeah, this is none of your business. And at that point, I am like, well, do I mean, to me, the obvious thing to do is call the police and go, I have just been threatened by a a youth to when I told them to stop doing some minor illegal activity, and call the cops. And then the question is, do the cops actually care?
Do the cops
Sometimes,
actually care? Well, they pulled the gun, so
maybe the cops care. Maybe they have something more going on. It's just,
it's just a crapshoot in general.
yeah, and to me, getting police to respond to those events with more, and respond to more, especially with like unarmed police or uh, less armed police, like the tier 1 kind of idea that you're talking about, getting them to show up so that there's kind of this ability for the police to deal with all of these levels of crime from minor to major. I I think that goes a long way in terms of prevention. And right now, there's not a lot of prevention out there in the kind of market, the kind of criminal environment.
Yeah, no, I think though it's like I think there needs to be though like cities need to start taking some personal responsibility. Like I think that's a big difference between rural communities and and cities, right? Like you said, it's like when there's something going on, well, the police call the police and they'll handle it, right? Whereas in a rural community, it'll be like, well, the police there's a sheriff and like three deputies, and
Mhm.
they cover like a 200 square mile area is their county that they handle, right?
Mhm.
And there's just those three police officers for that entire county. Like they cover a whole huge area, right? If if there's a problem, you have to be able to take care of it, right? Like the sheriff is there to handle things like later, right? It's like to fill out all the paperwork. Oh, this guy showed up and tried to tried to steal stuff from your house and you shot him in the face and he's dead. Yeah, the sheriff's there to kind of fill out the paperwork and be like, okay, what happened? Okay, he came in. Okay, that looks like self-defense to me, but we have to get a statement, right?
Mhm.
And I gotta take you into the inn, right? And we'll get this sorted out and I'll drive you home later tonight, but I'm gonna have to cuff you type thing. And the guy's like, yeah, sure, that's fine, right? Like that's sort of that's kind of how it goes in a small town, right? Like the sheriff is there to fill out paperwork and get things cleaned up for you rather than be there to get in a gun standoff with you, right, in your home.
Right.
Well, for the most part, right?
Yeah.
Like, like, like like maybe sometimes the sheriff shows up and there's a gunfight when the local pot farmer or drug dealer, you know, the pot farmer usually gets talked to by the sheriff, right? Like, you got to stop growing pot, man, right? He'll get the local church leader involved, right? And the church leader will be like, "You need to stop growing pot," and
Yeah.
then
Or other community leaders. Yeah.
yeah, or other community leaders, right? And then after all of that, the sheriff is like, "Okay, I have to deal with this now as the sheriff, right? Like I have given you 6 months to deal with this, and you have refused to deal with this." Right? And
Right.
then he shows up, and when he says, "I'm coming on this day. I'm coming to arrest you." Okay. And if the pot dealer's like, "Go ahead and try. I'll plant landmines in my front driveway." At that point, the sheriff and his deputies come,
Mhm.
ready to shoot you right in your front yard.
Yeah.
But it's like it takes that much to get a local sheriff to like show up guns blazing, right?
Yeah.
Which seems like and then when you compare that to the city, right? right? When you compare that to the city, it's like, well, why can't the city do that? Well, I hate to tell you this, city folks, right? Like, you have gangs that'll just drive by and shoot cops for the fun of it. Okay? Like, they just drive around shooting people. Like, just in Chicago, like a couple weeks ago, a 4-year-old kid was killed in a drive-by while in the drive-through of a McDonald's, right?
Yeah.
You would never have that happen in a rural community. Like if that happened, there would be a mob. They would find that person. Okay? That person's own mother would turn them in, if not just kill their kid right there and say, I took care of it. Okay? Like, that sort of crap would never fly in a rural community, ever. And the police are coming out and it's like, if anyone knows who did this, just give us information. And they can't get any information. It's like, in a rural community, their parents would turn them over, right? And be like, you fucked up majorly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that's the reason you can't have cops like the sheriff who will talk to the local pot dealer for like 6 months trying to get him to stop dealing pot and try to rehabilitate him, right? Like, cops are like that when they can be, and they can't be in cities. Like, that's not something cops can do. They have the luxury of. Right? And the reason they don't have that luxury is, well, because it's not because of it's not because they don't want it. Like, it's because the community doesn't give them that opportunity. Like, it's a culture thing. Like honestly, I think part of the problem, like, probably a good 50 or 70% of it, right? Or 75%. 3/4 of the problem is police training and how we have our police system structured, right? It's just ineffectively structured. But the other 25% is the culture in these communities. Like, the culture is just, we understand that crime happens. We're not going to stop our children from engaging in it. We're not going to stop family members. We're not going to stop other community members from engaging in it. That's the police job. And then you get upset when the police are trying to stop it and have to use deadly force. Like, you can't have it both ways, right? Like, if you don't want a bunch of deadly force being used, that's fine, right? Like, we can work on that. But you're going to have, like it has to be met somewhere in between, right? Like, it can't be all this, like there needs to be some accountability. You need to be able to hold your community members responsible. Turn them in, right? Hand them over to the police. Like, if someone messes up, if someone kills somebody, turn them over. Yeah, it's going to suck. Okay? Like, I'm not saying it's not going to suck, because it will. But, it's like, it might suck, but it'll clean up your community. It'll make your community safer. And in the long run, you guys you'll have a more peaceful and happy community. Okay, there's my rant. Probably going to get me in trouble. People are going to be upset. But that's honestly what I feel like. Like, having lived in a city and lived out in one of these countries, country towns, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
I barely know my neighbors. If like someone is screaming bloody murder in my household, I don't get a knock on my door saying, "Is everything okay?" No, it's whatever. Right? They could be outside on their front porch and someone screams bloody murder and they don't even bat an eye. It's like, why are you even my neighbor? And that's just my thinking because I'm from the country, right? Like, if someone screams or, like, I've even heard gunshots, right? And I get out, I walk down the street, and like see what's going on. I'm nosy that way. Everyone thinks I'm nosy. Like, even my wife is like, "Why are you doing that?" I'm like, "Because it sounded like a gunshot." It's like you don't go out there if there's a gunshot and like someone could be hurt. It's like, yeah, then someone could shoot you. It's like I don't like it's not like I don't care, right? Like I don't want to get shot, but it's well you look out for your neighbors, right? And it's like, no. Like I don't get it personally.
Yeah.
But it's a thing. Like it's a thing
I mean,
that happens a lot. And it's just how cities are. So
there is, I think, a societal question about whether how much of the 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 work of maintaining justice and societal kind of conformance with the rules uh, is an individual responsibility to put on um, each other, kind of thing. Like it's everybody's job and everybody has a part to play, kind of deal. And how much of it is, well, we offload that to a specific societal role in the police. And not offloading as much of it makes it a lot easier on police. It makes it a lot easier on the community as a whole, but it does entail a certain level of commitment and a certain level of risk from everyday citizens.
and I don't think most people are willing to deal with that. Like
Yep.
I don't think it's something that most people are willing to people aren't willing to put their necks out for anybody. So that part of cultural decay, I think, in general. Is like, is it affecting me? If not, then what's the point? Right? Like why should I be concerned? And there is none of that, right? Like if it's not me or my own, then I don't care. And
Hmm.
that gets to a lot of our problems. Like if you start thinking about it, right? Like all of the tribalism and things, right? It comes from this idea of if it's not my little group, right? Then I don't care. And people have successfully tapped into this idea of group identity, right? Where instead of this idea of community, right? Like the people I live with, like the people next door,
Mm-hmm.
or the people down the street, or just kind of like who I live with, right? Or who's near me. It's whose looks like me, who shares who shares this trait, right? Like who shares my skin color or who shares, my sexuality type deal, and making
Shares
a
my
yeah, or shares my religious beliefs or whatever it might be, right? um and we've gotten away from community, right? Like, you can have a neighbor next door, but um if they're different, right, they're not a member of your community, right? Like, they're not a member of your group. And it really is turning neighbors against neighbors. Like, I've read stories where neighbors have ratted on each other on things, right? And it's like I can understand for, say, like, someone's committed a crime or something, right?
Mhm.
um and you want to say that there's um there's a reason to, like, turn somebody in, right? But if it is just if it's just you know turning someone into the thought police on freaking handing someone over to the social mob, right? They have a bad opinion, or they voted for Trump or whatever, right? Or they have a Trump sign in their yard, right? And funny story about that. Someone ran over someone's Trump sign, and they put nails because they had someone drive through their yard multiple times.
Hmm.
Had put nails on the Trump sign, so when they drove over it, they popped all of their tires, and he ended up suing the person even though he popped all their tires and stuff. It was funny. But, it's things like that, right? Like, 20 years ago, who would have given a damn if you had a political sign in your yard for the opposing candidate? I mean, no one. Like, there would not be grounds enough to um, drive your vehicle into someone's yard and destroy their political signs, right? Like, no one would have ever thought of doing that except for, like, some really fringe people, right? But
Mhm.
now it's a way more common thing, right? It's like it in the idea is that, like, I'm saying like way too much. The idea is that with this need to, like, this idea of they're my enemy, right? If they don't match my particular traits or my particular class or whatever, race or whatever, right?
Mhm.
Is it's very damaging. Not only to I think it's damaging to people in general, like, not only to society as a whole, right? That's breaking down, but to the individuals who are like that, right? Like, I mean, these people must be literally terrified all the frickin' time. Like, if everyone who isn't your particular group or whatever, right, is an enemy, well, then you're just surrounded by enemies all the time. Like, they they have to go through so much mental anguish and torment to hold those beliefs, right? Like, it's not healthy. But I mean, that's probably a discussion for another time. Like,
Oh, that certainly is a
uh,
discussion for another time.
but it kind of goes on to this, like, how are we going to fix, like, policing in general, right? Like offer solutions. We have these ideals, but how do we move towards them? Because you
Mhm.
have um sure, we have an ideal, but we cannot move, personally, I don't think we can move to them in any sort of quickness, right? Like, there are people out there who are like, oh well, we need change now. Like, get rid of the entire police department and start from scratch. And it's just like, to me, that is like, that's dangerous. Like, you know how many people are going to get killed? Like, not just police officers, right? It's not just the newbie police officers that are going to get killed. It's a bunch of people in these communities that are going to get killed as well. I mean, if you think about it, right?
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
currently, how the training system works is they go to the academy and then they come out and they learn the ropes, right? Like,
Hmm.
they learn how to deal with things, right? From people who have years of experience.
Hmm.
And the stories that we've heard of cops getting scared and just pulling their gun and shooting other people, right?
Hmm.
Um, like with just simple traffic stops and things like that. Not a single one of those cases has the police officer had more than a couple years under their belt. Like, they're all new officers. And these people want to just wipe out all police officers as they currently are, like just start over from scratch and just have a completely fresh police force. Like, are you crazy? Like, do you know how many deaths there are going to be? Like, you're either going to have cops that are too unsure of themselves that they're going to pull their guns sooner than they should and end up killing innocent people for no reason, or they're going to be too afraid to use force and not know when to use force and end up getting killed anyway, right? Like, the amount of death we're talking about is insane, in my personal opinion, would be astronomical. Like, just so much. Like, and even then, I don't even think that those police departments would survive. Like after all said and done, I think they would all end up being useless anyway. Like, to be all in all honesty, they would all um it would all fall apart because they would not have they would experience too many casualties and they would have even less trust of the community because there would be more police shootings. So I mean I think it would exacerbate all the problems that we're currently seeing. And on top of making everything worse, would um, it wouldn't like it wouldn't end up being like we wouldn't end with seeing good things happen, right? Like,
Right.
it wouldn't change to the point where it would be like, oh well, at least after 5 or 6 years things would get better, right? It would be no, in 5 or 6 years we would be left with an empty shell of a police force that's still no better than
Yeah. I I think what we really need is more of a roadmap that can get done in a few years, perhaps. Um, we can do certain things immediately. Other things are going to take longer, um, but at least making meaningful progress. And we can talk about some of the steps um, next time because personally, I'm getting tired. In terms of moving our communities and our police departments towards the kind of ideal where it's not necessary to have as many uh, fully armed cops, and they're better trained, and um, all the things we have talked about today.
Okay. Well, we'll see you all next time. But go ahead and um, subscribe and like the video on YouTube. And
Yep.
hope you all have a good night. And we'll see you guys next week.